everyone, and welcome to the Forum on Russian, European, and U.S. Security. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Golfo Alexopoulos. I'm professor in the School of Interdisciplinary Global Studies and director of the Institute on Russia at the University of South Florida, and I will be your moderator for today's discussion. This conversation on social media and the Russian disinformation ecosystem is the second of a four-part series that runs every Wednesday at this time through the month of February. It's part of the Forum on Russian, European, and U.S. Security. The Forum is a partnership between the USF Institute on Russia and the J3 International Division at U.S. Special Operations Command. Our goal is to bring together an international group of academic and military professionals for a public conversation on timely and critical issues in global security. Please note that the video recording from session 1 from last week, The History and Challenge of Russian Disinformation, is now available on the USF Institute on Russia's website. The mission of the USF Institute on Russia is to advance knowledge and understanding of Russia and the surrounding region through interdisciplinary research, area studies, and global partnerships. I want to say thank you to our generous supporters and to those at SOCOM and USF whose hard work made this inaugural forum possible. It's now my pleasure to introduce my collaborator on the forum, Bill Flesser, who will introduce our exceptional panel of experts for today's discussion. Bill Flesser is Deputy Director of the J3 International Division at USSOCOM. He served in the U.S. Army for 22 years, primarily in Special Forces, retiring as the Deputy Director for Operations, Special Operations Command Europe. He earned master's degrees from the National War College and Cornell University, and he is the recipient of the Joint Civilian Service Achievement Medal and the Joint Meritorious Civilian Service Medal. Bill, over to you.
Golfo, thanks a lot, and thank you again, everyone online, for joining us in this second of what's turning out to be very interesting forums. Golfo gave you a quick rundown on J3 International. We have the honor of hosting 26 international partners from across the globe here at the United States Special Operations Command, and it gives us some unique insights to global security problems, and we're interested in sharing those insights with the USF student body and the Russia Institute. So thank you very much for joining us. We have a great panel today, starting with Dr. Michael Bracey, who is currently the Social Media Analysis and Research Manager Cell Chief at the Joint Military Information Support Web Ops Center, or JMWIC, at United States Special Operations Command. Yes, that is a name about this big, but that's how we roll in DoD. You got to have a cool acronym, JMWIC. Don't forget that one. Dr. Bracey's completed a PhD at King Fahd Islamic and Middle Eastern Studies Center at the University of Arkansas, following a Fulbright Research Scholarship in Lebanon. His research is focused on identity politics among Palestinians and Egyptians in the 20th century, and most recently he served as a social scientist supporting information operations in Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, and Yemen. Dr. Bracey, thanks for your service. Appreciate you doing that. Also on our panel today is Dr. Oscar Johnson. Oscar is the academic director at the Center for the Governance of Change at IE University in Spain. Oscar is the author of the book Russia, The Russia Understanding of War, published by Georgetown University Press. He holds a PhD from the Department of War Studies at King's College in London, and has earlier been subject matter expert at the Swedish Armed Forces headquarters. He is also a visiting research at the University of California, Berkeley. Our third panel member today is Dr. Joshua Tucker, is a professor of politics, affiliated professor of Russian and Slavic Studies, and affiliated direct professor of data science at New York University. Joshua is the director of NYU's Jordan Center for Advanced Study of Russia and the co-author of the NYU Center for Social Media and Politics. He's also co-author editor of the award-winning politics and policy blog, The Monkey Cage, at Washington Post. His recent books include Communism's Shadow, Historical Legacies and Contemporary Political Attitudes, and also Social Media and Democracy, The State of the Field of Prospects of the forum. Let me turn it back over to Dr. Alexopoulos. Again, thank you to our panel members, and thank you all for joining us.
Thank you, Bill. Before we begin, I want to remind everyone that the views and opinions expressed in these discussions are those of the panelists and don't necessarily reflect the official position of their respective institutions. We will begin with a moderated discussion followed by questions from the audience. When you submit your question, would you please let us know whether you're a student or an international guest? This way we can select a cross-section of questions from our diverse audience. So we'll cover a lot of topics today, from the use of social media in information operations to the Kremlin's understanding of information warfare to the recent arrest of Alexei Navalny and the popular protests in Russia. But let's begin with an examination of the medium we're here to discuss today. I'd like Michael Bracey to start us off, if you could, please. What makes social media an effective tool of information operations, and what are the limits of its efficacy? Thanks, Mike.
Thank you so much. It's good to be here and good to talk to everybody. I believe that one of the things that makes social media so effective for the Kremlin is that they really do focus on a couple of different persuasion methods, mostly consistency in messaging and a type of social proof where they may cast doubt on other statements or pose as an authority on a particular issue, and disseminate that down from domestic media to a series of proxies and then back into the international media environment. So it's a fluid movement of information. So for instance, as we begin to look at things like Russia's activities in Libya, I'm actually trained as an Arabist, so I spent a lot of time in that region, and it was something of interest to me. And one of the things we noticed last summer was that there were a lot of Syrians that were chartering flights to go to Libya. They would have their YouTube videos sort of depicting them boarding the plane and that type of thing. And it was kind of rumored that the Russians were facilitating that. But most pro-Kremlin proxies would say there's no Russian military presence, no weapons, nothing like that in Libya. So tracking that discussion online, what we could begin to see was a grouping of nodes or users that were talking about that. So if we could go actually to slide number 4 right quick, you can see a little visualization that. It's a little hard to read there, but one of the things that we looked for were nodes and vertices. And so by that, I mean a node is going to be a key user or a hashtag that's being used to promote this type of discussion. And then vertices really are going to measure the direction of that discussion and how frequently that node or that user plays a role in the discussion. So what you can see here, I know it's a little blurry here, but you've got 4 fairly distinct groups of users and proxies that were talking about this event. And right in the middle, a little hard to read there, but that's CNN. So the proxies would feed this information. It would be picked up by international journalists, and lo and behold, with no actual journalist on the site, the Kremlin could come away effectively by saying there were no Russian military personnel in Libya. But there is a limitation to this now, because, of course, Russia has its own platform on social media, if you will, that was developed there, fairly unique to a lot of Russian users, called VK. So if we could go to slide number 1. One of the things that we began to see when we would pull API data pulls out of this area, and that is just a stream of data that's coming from the internet, we saw along the coastal areas a lot of the usual suspects: YouTube users, journalists reporting from the coastal area. But lo and behold, in the central desert area of Libya, there were a whole bunch of VK postings. And all of those, of course, what we found out when we looked at those posts, they were Wagner Group members, so mercenaries being put out by the Kremlin as a cost-effective way to exert influence in the area all around the airbase of Azovstal. Now, when we began to look at those posts, one of the things you see is, what most people, when they're deployed, are going to be writing back to family and friends and talking about the work that they do. So eventually, we found a post that had a couple missiles in the background. So with a little bit of OPSEC issues, we could then repost or amplify the message that, lo and behold, the Kremlin is misleading us through these proxies, and that's getting into the international media feed. But remember, they're creating a long-term sort of mental map on this messaging. So if we could go to slide number 5 right quick, what you can see is analysts looking at this over time can chart again, a lot of discussion on this topic by proxies in the summer of 20. Then things begin to drop off pretty dramatically. COVID begins to enter in the international discussion and kind of dominate that. But lo and behold, in February, the new administration comes in, and the U.S. Chargé d'Affaires at the United Nations calls for a Russian military withdrawal from Libya. And what does this little spike that we're beginning to see in February say? If we go look at those pro-Kremlin proxies, they're saying the same thing that they did before in a consistent manner. There's no picture of Russian airplanes, no picture of Russian soldiers. There's an old airport, and it used to be used by the Gaddafi regime, nothing more than that. And that feeds right back into CNN and other international media outlets. So using that type of social proof, along with consistent messaging, the Kremlin is very, very effective in terms of using social media, perhaps even more so than the criticism that they had just a few days ago, as Novyety Gazety pointed out that the Kremlin has spent over $600 billion for foreign influence over the last 20 years. And this particular few months, talking about developments in Russia with their proxies, cost a fraction of that.
Thank you very much. I'd like to turn now to Josh, if you would pick up on this question of social media's efficacy and the limits of its efficacy, and address specifically how social media manipulates human emotions and accelerates the process of political polarization, which you've done research on. If you could elaborate on that, please.
It's my pleasure. When we think about how social media manipulates, I want to make a point. First is that one thing we know, social media absolutely does privilege viral content, right? So that's one feature of social media, which makes it so that things that are more likely to spread widely, these get boosts, and this allows, and in turn, it leads people, incentivizes people to try to produce things that are more likely to be viral. One of the things we've learned about things that are more likely to be spread on social media is that things that appeal to emotions are potentially more likely to be able to be spread and more likely to get to, or potentially more likely to get to this kind of viral point. So we have a paper that we did in the Proceedings of National Academy of Sciences that shows that tweets that had what was called moral emotional language in them, so things that appeared to both moral ideas but also had emotional content, spread faster than tweets on the same subjects, and we were looking at 3 big political subjects, then tweets that had we're talking about similar subjects, but didn't have this moral emotional language in it. Now, so we do know that social media is set up to privilege viral content. That's how the economics of the social media sphere works. We know a little bit that things that are more emotional seem like they're going to spread more. There's other research in this regard as well. We found this moral emotional piece of it. But we don't know, and I think it's really important to know about this, we don't know whether there is a direct link between social media usage and rising political polarization. So yes, We have seen the rise of social media over the last 10 years, over the last decade, and a little bit longer than that now. And we've seen the rise of political polarization in a lot of countries, the United States especially. But this rise of social media globally coincides with a lot of other trends globally, right? There's been the Great Recession over this time period. There's been, going back to the Middle East, there's been the migration out of Syria into Europe that has had an effect on polarization, right? We had the rise of Donald Trump in the United States, which had the effects on polarization, and of course we've had the pandemic over the past year, right? In the United States, in particular, there are other drivers out there of increasing political polarization that go beyond, and in some cases have nothing to do with social media. We've seen a very long-term trend in the United States about the sorting of conservatives and liberals by party. We used to have conservatives in the Democratic Party in the South. We used to have liberals in the North. And now we've seen the sorting of that, where now liberals are all firmly ensconced in the Democratic Party, conservatives firmly ensconced in the Republican Party. But we've also seen developments on the larger media ecosystem. So, for example, social media is part of that media ecosystem, apologies, but so too is TV cable news. And if we want to think about sort of the great driver of polarization in the United States, if we go back in the US and compare to the 70s and even the 80s when we had, or the 60s and 70s, where we had 3 dominant networks where everybody watched the evening news, and then we compare that to what came next, which was the emergence of cable network news, where we all of a sudden have options where there's huge numbers of cable channels. People can stop watching the evening news because there are other options, but at the same time, people can also begin to look for partisan news that reflects their existing political preferences. So we do have this idea that there are other factors driving this. Now, on the other hand, there is more recent research from Hunt Alcott, who was at NYU, and Matt Genskow at Stanford, that showed in an experiment when they pulled people off of Facebook in the United States for a month, they found that actually lowered levels of what's called affective polarization, or dislike of outgroup partisans. However, at our lab at the Center for Social Media and Politics, we've recently run a new study where we did the same thing in Bosnia at a time of the Srebrenica commemoration, at a time of sort of heightened ethnic identities. And what we found was that actually in the Bosnian context, pulling people off social media actually increased levels of ethnic outgroup affective polarization. So there's still a lot going on here and a lot that we don't know about this relationship. So we have some theoretical reasons to think why social media would increase political polarization, but there's lots of other things going on, and I think the nuances of it are quite distinct, and we need to do a lot more research in this regard to tease out these different things that are going on and learn a lot more about it, and resist the temptation to sort of have one high-level conclusion about this.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Also, would you like to speak to this question of the efficacy and the use of social media as a tool?
Yeah, sure thing. You hear me, right?
Yes.
Good, very good. Well, thank you for that, both Michael and Josh. There's so much to pick up on already from the beginning, and I mean, thank you also Golfo and J3 for having this discussion. It's always nice to blend academia with practitioners in this way. So, first of all, I just want to say, fully agree with what Josh's saying. I mean, political polarization we've seen in the US, we've seen in Western Europe. I mean, it's been increasing for a long time. We see a decline in the belief of democracy going on for decades. So this is not, let's not think of it as new, but to try to start somewhere to tease out why is social media an interesting venue for disinformation, if you want to call it that, or propaganda and persuasion, perhaps. It's very much a sensationalist nature. I mean, the algorithms controlling the social media are premiering things with emotional engagement. I like that Josh gave emphasis to that as well, because I think we're quite often missing that part. We have a very rationalist view of saying, hey, if we have this information, let's just fact check it, because people would read fact check and they will be convinced by logic, whereas that misses a lot of aspects of what drive human behavior. I like to use Thucydides, who says, fear, honor, and interest. And if we're thinking interest as a term of rational logics, we're very much thinking of that, not kind of belonging, existential questions, and honor. And also, I mean, there was a big Oxford Internet Institute study in 2017 showing that junk news was spreading a lot faster and better than normal news. But I think the most straightforward answer I can get to the question, why is so much of this disinformation happening in social media? And I mean, there's a very straightforward answer, and that is that social media is basically the infrastructure today through which we see the world. There's a kind of small number of algorithms that is shaping to a large degree what we perceive. And this is also the funny part. We're seeing very different things depending on our data. But there's two things that is making this very, very different from cable TV or print news. And that is that the social media companies are platforms. They are by law not responsible for the content. And they are also platforms lacking editors. So you don't have a liability, and you don't have someone kind of trying to moderate the most stupid things. And it's also, tendering to filter bubbles, etc. And then the second part is that it's data driven. It's that it's, in the example of Facebook, they don't sell your data, but they say, well, access to you based on your data. So you can target everyone in Michigan or everyone in New York and everyone who's working in higher education, etc., which makes the ability to target very, very particular groups. You compare it with mass marketing is the worst way of trying to target specific groups, because you know quite well who you want to reach. You put up big posters trying to target everyone, whereas now you can buy access very particular to, say, someone has shown a very big interest in this type of activism questions. Let's start to hijack those with these narratives. And conversely, on the opposite of the spectrum, they have shown an interest here, let's target them. So long story short, I mean, social media are very much infrastructure, and they are selling access to you based on quite a lot of information on who you are and what you do. And it makes it a very, very good tool and venue for information operations.
So can we pick up on this question of the algorithms? I want to ask you, Michael Breesy, how would you would assess the role and power of these social media algorithms in spreading disinformation from the Russian state and its proxies?
Well, I would say that it's very effective, again, because they're consistent in their messaging, and it then reaches a fairly broad but also targeted audience, as Oscar had mentioned, because you can use specific keywords within an algorithm then to target this audience using a certain number of hashtags or images, that type of thing. So it becomes a very loud amplifier, if you will. And one of the things that we've noticed, there's a lot of discussion about the authentic behavior of some of these proxies, and some of them, of course, do indicate very coordinated inauthentic behavior online, or bot activity that we would usually use in that type of parlance. Identifying those accounts and identifying those handles could be fairly easy. So one of the things that we tend to look for are the use of a photograph or an avatar that's used by the account. The number of posts or reposts that are done by that particular account, the age of the account, and we can set a whole number of algorithms so that we can pull that data all together. But this is where you still need a dedicated analyst to be able to understand how those accounts work. So, for instance, we identified a related series of bot activities with the Wagner group in Libya that I talked about earlier. But lo and behold, one of those that was identified by the machine actually turned out to be a real person, although they used wildlife on their and animals for their avatars and a lot of their photos. It wasn't a very old account, but it did retweet a lot of pro-Kremlin statements on a frequent basis. It seemed to match that algorithm perfectly, but what we found out by an analyst digging a little bit deeper into that account was it was a journalist working out of Jamaica, and essentially sort of fit that bill. So there still needs to be an effective balance, I think, between a human analyst looking at these accounts that are collected by a larger, say, machine learning or artificial intelligence capability.
Joshua, could you tell us a little bit, could we turn now to the domestic Russian situation and the fact that many protesters and Navalny's team certainly have been among the biggest targets of Russian disinformation. Could you talk to us a little bit about how Navalny uses social media and how the Kremlin has responded by using social media to discredit him and spread disinformation?
Sure. So I think the short answer to how Navalny uses social media is creatively. One of the kind of really super interesting things about social media is that it has been, simultaneously called liberation technology in the sense that it was something that was going to bring democracy around the world. And it's been called, can democracy survive the internet, right? It's also going to be something that brings down the internet. And we had a piece that we wrote in the Journal of Democracy where we tried to sort of unify these two things and ask, like, how could social media be both liberation technology and can democracy survive the internet? And did one of these approaches get it wrong? It was originally liberation technology. Now it's can democracy survive the internet? And in the paper that we wrote, in the Journal of Democracy article that we wrote on this, what we argue is that if you make two simple assumptions, you can explain how social media can be both liberation technology and can democracy survive the internet. One of which is that social media gives voice to people who lack access to mainstream media. The second is, despite the fact that social media democratizes access to the internet, access to information, and that's indisputable, it's still also a tool that it can be used as a tool for censorship. And we have a whole argument in that article, which I'm happy to talk more about later if we want, but I want to bring this back to Navalny. The issue with Navalny is that Navalny is exactly the kind of person who we're talking about in non-democratic systems who's going to be excluded from access to mainstream media. You're not going to see Navalny showing up on Russian state television programs shouting his message. But what he's learned is the ability to use social media in order to get around this. And this is a phenomenon that we see all over the world, from pro-democracy activists to anti-democracy activists in democratic systems, right, who are not going to have access to mainstream media. In particular, what Navalny has been incredibly successful with is a series of YouTube videos, which he has used to give visuals to hone his message. Navalny's message famously about the ruling party is they're a party of crooks and thieves, right? But Navalny has given video to this, and he's given visuals to this. First, there was this expose about Medvedev when he, I think when he was president, maybe when he was prime minister, about Medvedev's house and all the wealth he had includes, and then more recently this palace, this $1.3 billion palace. And the release of this YouTube video was timed exactly with Navalny returning to Russia, Navalny getting arrested, which of course there was filming, people were there to film him getting arrested, and that was put out on social media. So Navalny's supporters tend to be younger in Russia, and we have seen in the most recent rounds of protests in Russia, we've seen, more and more young people participating in these protests, and young people are particularly savvy in the use of social media. Now, in the most recent round of this, what we saw was the emergence of, for a brief period of time, we saw a flurry of activity on TikTok, which is another platform that we wouldn't even have been talking about, 3 years ago here because it didn't exist. But there was a series of short videos that were run both during the protest, but impressively before the protests. And TikTok sometimes has a little pranky feel to it. It was famously used in the U.S. election to organize people to mess up Trump's first rally in Omaha, Nebraska that took place and pretend to reserve all the seats there. And the prankster part of it kind of played out in Russia, where you had young Russians going into their schools, taking down pictures of Putin on the wall and putting up pictures of Navalny and making TikTok videos of them. They were also making TikTok videos of themselves preparing to go out and protest. So social media has become a mesh in this sense of protest. Now, we've also been doing research in our lab, much like Michael was talking about. We've been working in our lab on doing research to detect Russian bots in Russian political Twitter. And this has been going on for 5 years now, where we started working on this back in 2013. And one point I just wanted to add quickly on Michael's point was to be really, really careful. I'm glad you raised the point of the machine learning models getting it wrong, because one of the things we've been doing really carefully about, we developed a really good machine learning model for identifying bots in Russia in 2015 and 2016. And we've been then systematically estimating how well it does the next year. If we trained it just on 2015 data, how did it do on 2016? And we were pleasantly surprised, but then we ported the model to the United States and it did terribly. So I think it's really, really important, and we've been spending now time retraining this to detect bots in US political Twitter around the same time of 2016. So it's really, really important to think about testing and subjecting these models, being really careful to see how portable they are off of the time periods on which they were trained. But a last word on this is that we have, after a number of years of training up these models to find Russian bots, one of the most interesting things we found in our study of this was that we found tons of bots in Russia in this particular period of time, but we found what was interesting, both pro-Kremlin bots, but also lots of anti-Kremlin bots. And they were anti-Kremlin bots from the proportion of Russian domestic politics, but also pro-Ukrainian anti-Kremlin bots. And then a whole ton of neutral bots, which sounds like a bit like what Michael was describing. And these were bots that just tended to repeat newspaper headlines. And the super interesting thing about this was that the newspaper headlines they would retweet, some of them would be retweeted with links, which would make sense if you were trying to make something go viral or trying to build up an audience or get people to actually read things. But we also found tons of Russian bots retweeting headlines that had no links attached to them. They were just the headline, which seems very puzzling because it's not clear what anyone would do with this unless you begin to think that what the bots are trying to do is not deceive human beings or not aiming at a human audience, but they're trying, going back to your original question, they're trying to have an effect on algorithms. So this is called search engine optimization. And so what we think a lot of these Russian bots were doing at this point in time, were trying to game search engines. In particular, Yandex, which was like a Russian version of Yahoo, had a trending headlines. And we think that this was part of what was going on here. But we've subsequently now more recently been doing research on this to look at how Russian bots react to Twitter, react to protests. So this comes back to Navalny, looping back to Navalny again, and then I'll stop. And one of the interesting things that's come out of this paper is that we've seen more bot activity in response to online protests, so days when Russian opposition figures are particularly active online, than we have to actual offline Russian behavior, which suggests part of what Michael was saying there before, that with the offline, when you actually have protests in the streets, there may be all sorts of tools the Russians that are deploying to deal with this. But with the online activity, these online bots may be particularly keyed into it and tied in with algorithms as well. So thanks.
Thank you. I'd like to zoom out from Russia again and go back to the geopolitical context and ask Oscar specifically about how the Kremlin understands information warfare, how it sees itself in a war with the West and the United States, and how is the Western view of information warfare distinct from the Russian view of information warfare?
Yeah, I mean, I think that fits perfectly what was said before that. I think that there's a grasp among the Russian leadership that the opportunities of information confrontation are just radically increasing, and a large degree of legitimacy, power is being formed, right? Exactly what we're speaking of. It's what is trending on Yandex, what is what is trending on Twitter, what is trending on Google. So it's really about understanding that a lot of modern power basically comes from the information sphere today, and the realization among Russian leaders that, hey, we need to think about this. So to answer the questions also a little bit, what to do with algorithms, what to do with social media. In my book, I paint kind of a long-term evolution of Russian information warfare, starting from the first Chechen war, where Putin says that a big part of why they lost was the lack of morale, which media contributed to, and it was hugely unpopular in Russia, and journalists could freely go around and meet the soldiers. So the second Chechen war, they updated, only had embedded journalists, controlled the reporting, but then the Chechen separatists and jihadists managed to gather a lot of support on the internet, and after that, internet was securitized. After the Georgian War 2008, the Russian strategists are saying, hey, why did we lose the information war? We managed to get the Georgians to shoot first. And then after that, they expanded RT to RT Arabic, RT US, RT UK, RT Spanish, etc. And fast forward, the Arab Spring, exactly what Joshua was saying, it was seeing that, internet, social media driven revolutions, now social media is coming to free us all. And they, of course, spilled over into the Russian elections, presidential and parliamentary election 2011, 2012. And after that, of course, Russian leadership was scared and seeing, hey, there's a power and mobilization here in social media. So to my knowledge, the first reported existence of the Internet Research Agency, which is the most famous troll factory, which everyone has heard of, was in 2013. But it was not promoting messages saying that, hey, the West is decadent and pedophilia and drugs. It was saying Navalny is bad and Sobyanin is good, and it was for the mayoral election on spring 2013. It was only after the invasion of Ukraine that the IRA became international. And you fast forward that again, and I also think that was captured very well. A lot of what, and I mean, the point I'm trying to get across here is that a lot of what Russia is doing is really just looking at how is the world changing. Okay, the crisis in media makes traditional media being less important and social media more important. Okay, well, how do we get impact on social media and the algorithms that is shaping what we see? And as you're saying, the civilian private branch of this is called search engine optimization, but that's apparently something strategists needs to do today, which is something, for instance, Western strategists doesn't think that much about until they're seeing that, you know, Russia is doing it really well. If you were Googling white helmets on YouTube about up until 1 year ago, you got like 7 out of 10 Sputnik RT pro-Russian conspiracy theories determining what you were seeing about chemical weapons in Syria. So it's effective, and that's and yeah, you also asked me, what is the difference about this? Well, for long term, this has been, you know, the Western approach, and you can see the international negotiations on information security and cybersecurity from a decade ago, where the Western consensus is super clear, as saying we need to have free flow of information because our society is based on free speech, and the integrity of cyber systems. And the Eastern consensus, Russia and China, is saying information in itself can be dangerous. We need to limit what kind of information that can be said. Actually, now I think the Western consensus understand the Eastern consensus a lot more, given what happened since 2016 with disinformation and the last years only, and especially what's happening just this year with big tech giants taking some executive decision of throwing Trump out there and throwing other things out there, seeing that, just as Joshua said again, that there's this idea that, you know, the internet will ruin democracy. So to try to be crisp, I think that in the West, we always have focused on free flow of information. The fact that we're speaking about this information now is the kind of receipt that we, you know, 5, 6, 7 years after the Russian leadership has started thinking about in what circumstances are actually information dangerous. I'll stop there.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Michael, did you want to add something here?
Indeed, I think that another part that really supports what Oscar and Joshua had mentioned before that we noticed is very, very skillful narrative development that pro-Kremlin proxies will have. So, for instance, there was some heightened naval activity in the Arctic over the last several months of last year, and it sort of looked like an old Cold War sort of a NATO mirroring Russian claims to the Arctic. One of the things that pro-Kremlin proxies did was they took a very specific demand that the U.S. had been making over the past 4 years, that NATO members spend more money. And they targeted that to Norway and Norwegian political leaders, saying that your country now is in a sort of compromised position, because not only is all this NATO or all this naval activity taking place in your area, but you're being required to spend more money on your own military when you could have been spending it on social programs within your country. Probably on a larger scale, we saw a really quick merger of the social justice movement here in the United States over the last summer linked to COVID issues. So very quickly, one of the things we saw at the end of the year as the question of COVID vaccines began to take a center stage on social media discussions, was pro-Kremlin outlets would point out that this social justice movement in the United States stems from a type of systematic racism. There's a devaluation of certain people, and that is why the West and the United States in particular were willing to test their vaccines on African populations before they moved to, say, more European or Northern populations. So very, very quickly capitalizing on political statements or political movements in the West, I think the Kremlin really ties those together very, very quickly and very effectively to reach some of these audiences. And demonstrate that type of social proof and consistency in messaging.
Thank you. I see that we're getting some great questions, so I would like to move now to some of our audience questions that are really very good. Could I ask Josh to address the first one? Does the U.S. use both open and not so open ways of sending our own kind of information to Russia and her citizens? And please, if Oscar or Michael wants to add to this, I'm going to ask you, Josh, please.
You're on mute, Josh.
Apologies about that. Sorry. I was just going to say, I think I should defer to Oscar or Michael or in particular Michael on that, and in that we haven't studied the effect of U.S. intelligence operations on propaganda. The one thing I will add, though, is just there is a long historical context here, right, of both the United States and Russia trying to, pursue their interests through information strategies in other countries. So when we talk about open sources and open means of doing this, of course, right, we have Radio Free Europe and Radio Liberty and all sorts of things that we have tried to do over the years, and the Russians have tried to do, the exact same thing with RT and coming back at these cases. I was struck by when Michael was talking about the narrative, right, around COVID and vaccine testing and Africa, just how much that echoes going back to Soviet history of narratives of playing up narratives of racism in the United States. And, when we talk about open source, right, like the U.S. has a history of racism in the United States. These are things that are there, these aren't things that, and these aren't things that are being made up, right? These are things that begin to blur the line between what is propaganda and what is misinformation and what is disinformation, right? And this becomes a really big question, going back to Oscar's point about, and one of the big challenges for the platforms and how you respond to things, right? Is there a difference between an RT, putting stuff up on Facebook and putting stuff up on Twitter, which is clearly an arm of Russian state propaganda, but is there a difference between when they're sharing information that's, overtly partisan but is not factually incorrect versus when they're sharing information that's factually incorrect? And and this gets into sort of really dicey issues about how you respond to things. And I really did like Oscar's characterization of that countries are, and I would you characterize this East versus West. I would characterize it more as sort of authoritarian versus open societies, right? But when you're a closed society and it's accepted that as part of your system of government, you restrict access to information, a China, a Russia, what we call authoritarian regimes, there is a whole set of trade-offs in a way that you don't have to address, that you do have to address in open societies. Now, there are other sorts of trade-offs, right, which is when we think about how regimes respond to online opposition. We have a piece that we published in Comparative Politics where we sort of set out a typology of the ways that authoritarian regimes could respond to online opposition. And they have offline ways in which they can respond. And that can include, going after online bloggers or people who are posting, arresting them, in extreme cases, shooting them. It can also, though, involve things online like changing legal liability rules within countries and changing ownership of countries. You brought up, Michael, you brought up VK, like VK was previously, the CEO of VK was basically chased out of the country because he wasn't cooperating with the Kremlin. But there are also these online ways that you can respond to online opposition. And we talked about one of them before, which was online responses in terms of trying to change the conversation by using bots and trolls and even this, journalists or paid informants or Confederates or however you want to do this, right? You can try to positively manipulate the conversation online to become in your favor. But we also can think about traditional tools of censorship, like online restriction of access to content. And that's where the trade-offs come for the more closed societies, because what kind of economic opportunities are you shutting off for people? And when do you get inadvertent, effects of shutting things down? So Molly Roberts at UCSD has this fantastic paper with co-authors where she shows that when China tried to crack down on Instagram, what ended up happening was way more people downloaded VPNs. And then people who really just wanted to see pictures of their friends on Instagram started going to the New York Times and Google because suddenly they had VPNs and could get over the Chinese firewall. So there are those questions. But you're absolutely right that in open societies, we face this trade-off, right, between a commitment to open access to information and the idea under which the concerns of which foreign information, right, and information we may want to restrict access to, can undermine things like democracy in our countries. However, I would just add one more point on this, which is that whereas the foreign interference gets a ton of the attention, and this is what we were all talking about after 2016, the Russians had Twitter accounts in the United States, right? This was inevitably going to be and has been dwarfed by the amount of domestic actors that are going to want to employ the exact same toolbox. And this is things we started talking about immediately after 2016, and it's absolutely come to fruition, right? One of the reasons we're not talking about Russian disinformation in the 2020 election is because there was so much domestic disinformation that was produced in the context of the 2020 US election. And indeed, the sort of single biggest purveyor of disinformation about the results of the 2020 election was the president of the United States. So this puts in huge new challenges on the system. And this is what Oscar was talking about before. These are, these kind of extraordinary actions, if you think about them, by the platforms in removing the president of the United States a couple weeks before his term is over from Twitter, from Facebook. These are these kind of challenges, but these kind of challenges are not going away, and they're going to continue to be really serious questions about how, and I guess we're going a little bit before here, but this has an impact on the question, which was a great one, about these above board and these below board, or these open and covert attempts to influence the information environment. Covert attempts become less necessary, right, when these overt attempts have so many options and so many things you can do, but that then puts this really challenging situation on how you maintain a commitment to a free and open society in the face of wanting to put these kind of restrictions in place.
Thank you. I'd like to address another audience member's question. I recall reading some research that showed that as people are exposed to more advertising of all kinds, they began to filter it. Therefore, advertising becomes less effective. The same doesn't seem to be true for misinformation, disinformation, and why not? This is somebody from NATO Joint Force Command.
If I can jump in.
Please, Oscar, yes.
In some things, I'd just love to jump at the previous one first, and then we can get to that one. So I think, yet again, this is a quintessential example of when, the social media is not the problem. The US president will always have a platform, even if he's suspended from social media. So, that's not the start of disinformation, it's big amplification of it. And I think that's right. But above, the US having a lot of domestic information, I would say the former US president also increases the vulnerability to foreign disinformation. And I think one example that I just love is President Trump coming out saying that Montenegro is a very aggressive country when Montenegro was on its way into NATO. And then you ask, where does this idea come from? I can bet you a lot that it's not a U.S. intelligence agency saying that Montenegro is an aggressive country. I don't think President Trump has sit down and read up a lot on Montenegro and say, hey, these guys' policies are very aggressive. The only place I've heard it is within the Russian disinformation system. So I'm not saying that President Trump was reading them himself, but I think it underlines that his information circles are information circles that are susceptible to the Russian disinformation, such as, for instance, Breitbart, etc., and other, who just likes really nasty and nice anti-establishment stuff. And that's a way in which the foreign disinformation can be there. So in terms of the question, you're asking at a U.S. Special Operations Command event if the U.S. is doing special operations. I couldn't possibly comment on that. I don't know that much about it, actually, to be honest. I haven't looked into it. But I think there's something that I want to bring up, and that's it. It is a problem if when someone else is doing it, we're calling it disinformation, and when we're doing it, we're calling it strategic communications. This is also one reason why I don't like the term disinformation to begin with, just like Josh said, because a lot of it might be true. I mean, the hacked emails from the Democratic National Committee were absolutely hacked and legit. And I think that's why I said earlier, I said propaganda or persuasion. And I think that it's, the marketplace of ideas, people are just bidding with narratives and see what sticks. And a lot of it is mostly correct or semi-correct. My best way of thinking about how to deal with this problem so far is not really focusing on content. In any kind of normal distribution, in any kind of society, you will always have a certain amount of conspiracy theories, everything from anti-vaxxers to the moon was a hoax, the moon landing. The problem is really twofold. It's the inorganic amplification of really bad things. And one of this is, it's partly having to do, as I said, as we talked from the beginning, it's with social media. There are, premiering sensationalism over veracity. And the second one is actors gaming the algorithms, trying to create the inorganic amplification by everything using bots, which is something I'm not that worried about because it's quite easy to automatically to find them and take them away. But it's really injecting inorganic material into the debate, whereas the debate always had really extreme ends. But now we're having both a business model and a platform, plus foreign actors trying to really ramp up the fringes, and you can feel that. The question was, why are we not getting more susceptible? Why are we not getting more resilient to disinformation when we're getting into ads? I mean, I always looked at ads with suspicion. I never clicked one in my own life. Actually, they're getting better. Like just the last 6 months, I've actually seen useful things coming in my feed. So I'm getting worried how much they know about me. I think a lot of disinformation and misinformation, or if rather just call it propaganda and persuasion, it caters so much to, I would say, emotion and existential and belonging. And I think it's more about that you want them to be true rather than your analytical brain saying, hey, this is exactly how I think and this is a credible way of doing it. I think we're underestimating that part, how much our, and that's also deeply part of our human. One of, our morals and values are performing a social function. I mean, from when we were born in the state of nature, which doesn't exist, but it's a useful metaphor that's been used by a lot more clever people than me. We use morals as a tool of bonding to survive, and I think that the short story. I think that's a really part of it to try and understand why this is effective. It caters to our emotions and our belonging rather than our sense of this is actually true.
Mm-hmm. Michael, I'd love for you to jump in here and on the subject of inauthentic or authentic amplification. You mentioned CNN and how authentic journalists become the purveyors of much of this disinformation. Could you address how exactly journalists can avoid falling into these traps? Is there a way of detecting where this information is coming from?
Sure, I'd like to comment on that. I do think, as a follow-up to what my colleagues have mentioned, when we do utilize some sort of public platform like Radio Free Europe or Voice of America, that tends to come from, it's seen as an outside source. So much to what Oscar had mentioned, Russians or any other group can easily resist that type of thing. That's not a message that belongs to us. So I think really getting the Russian domestic audience to be critical of some of these pro-Kremlin proxies in a manner that sort of calls out their limited sourcing, I think is really, really important. And so there it might be something as simple, if we can't label them trolls, gremlins are pretty close to trolls, and gremlin and Kremlin are sort of used, are very close in Russian, just like they are in English. So using a sticker where you could put a gremlin on a bit of misinformation, you could easily identify that as a pro-Kremlin proxy, not utilizing multiple sources, and really beginning to lead to maybe that type of, if not disinformation, maybe misinformation, just a little bit of information that's kind of leading people down the wrong conclusion. But coming from a domestic audience, I think that probably would be a much more effective way to sort of counter that. And for journalists, I think what that means is, again, multiple source checking, and it becomes both easy, as Joshua had mentioned, to sort of use social media as a democratic voice in terms of having more and more sources, but it also becomes a little bit of an easy button, if you will, that you can simply go to some of these proxies that are tweeting certain bits of information, pick them up, and then pass them on as truth. It's certainly cheaper for international news agencies to function that way. They don't have to have journalists on the ground and pay for stringer networks and all of these kind of added costs, when all you need to do is start up an account and start collecting information based on keywords. So I think really it's a need to emphasize multiple sources in reporting rather than just one or two, which social media tends to favor that one or two source.
Thank you. Josh, we have a question specifically about your research. So I will address this to you. This is from a researcher at USF. There seems to be a number of theories about how information goes viral on social media. Some are based on novelty, gist, moral foundations, or network structure. How do we test which ones work and why?
Right. So I think there's two ways to test, and we probably want to be doing these simultaneously and having papers that do it at both levels. So the first is in the lab. We can test whether or not our theories hold in very controlled environments about what type of information people are more likely to be willing to share or to be wanting to share information. And that gives us a lot of control over what's going on. We can use randomized assignment. We can do all sorts of things that we want to do in really tightly controlled social science research. This is, for example, the paper that I mentioned before about this moral emotional language did not use that approach. So what we used in that approach was the other approach, which is that we can actually observe things that are happening on social media platforms. And we can take our theories to the data and test and see what's spreading and what's out there and what is spreading. Now, both of these things are valuable because on the social media platforms, it's harder to assign causality to anything. We can look at what's going on, but there may be lots of different reasons that it's spreading. Whereas in the lab, we could take the same exact piece of information and vary, for example, the emotional level of the content or something like that. So the labs allow us to sort of dive in these deeper things. But I think it's also super important, and it's worth reiterating 2 points here. One of the things that's really interesting about social media is just how many people have an opinion about it. Social media permeates our lives, and so everybody has an opinion about what happens with social media. And it's really easy for things to quickly become received wisdom because we see things, right? So, for example, we studying these things and seeing if these things that we suppose are happening, that we observe at a very, very small scale, if they actually hold when we zoom out and look at these at larger scale, these are much, much more complicated studies to do. And so I think it's very important when we have studies about what types of things are more likely to spread and why, right? The why we can investigate in the lab. where we can control these environments, but the what is more likely to spread and how much it spreads. These involve sort of careful, kind of large scale studies where we go out and we track this kind of information. And the thing, I would make two caveats here. One is, it's super important in these social media studies to make sure you have a baseline that you're comparing to what, right? Like, one of the things about social media is because it's so big and it's optimized for search, you can find evidence of anything, right? And so you need to have baselines, right? If you want to say something like, was there a lot, was hate speech going up after the 2016 US elections online? Well, it's easy to find hate speech online, but finding whether or not it's gone up or not is actually much more complicated. And then finding out what the denominator is that actually a tiny, tiny fraction of what's being observed online, or is it something that's a larger fraction that's being observed online? That's a much more sort of complex task. The second piece of this that I want to just make a plea for, because I try to work it into every talk I ever do in a public forum, is that to the extent that you, the audience here, right, our policymakers, our future scholars, our future workers, all these people who are doing these things, to the extent that you're interested in the answers to these questions, we as researchers, and those of us who are researchers who are going to do research where our results will be publicly reported, where they will be in the public domain, will they be able to inform policymaking, we need to have access to this data. It's a really kind of crazy time to be doing social science research right now. In the book, in the Social Media and Democracy book, Nate Persley and I, in the concluding chapter, we talk about how it's the best of times and the worst of times for doing social science research, right? On the one hand, with the advent of digital trace data, of which social media is a sort of prime example, but not the only example, we have more information about human beings and how humans behave and how they interact with each other and how they interact with the political sphere than we have ever had in the history of the known planet. Like, it's just unbelievable the amount of stuff that we can look about, like the charts that Michael was showing earlier, network analyses and these kinds of things. We could only dream about doing this kind of work 10 years ago. But we're also in a really weird situation, because if you're a political scientist like I am, most of the research that was done in political science prior to years was either done using administrative data, that's data that was released by governments like unemployment rates and election totals, or it was done doing data that we collected ourselves with surveys, or we ran experiments or something like that. Now we have this incredible access to data to answer these types of questions, but the data that we need to answer them is controlled, like in the case of the United States, by like 2 or 3 enormous global companies, right, that are subject to all sorts of legal constraints, that are subject to all sorts of commercial imperatives, right? And what we can learn scientifically from this data is limitless, right? And it's not just about politics. It's about disaster relief. It's about health. It's about preventing teenage suicide. It's about all sorts of things, right? But to the extent that we are prevented from accessing this data, what it means is that the lessons, the scientific advancements that can be made are going to be limited by what researchers inside those companies do and what they choose to share publicly, which they may or may not be allowed to share things publicly. And so to the extent that we, like the questioner and like people here in the audience, they want to know the answers to the questions. They want to empower people like the panelists here today to be able to give those kinds of answers. When the inevitable reckoning comes around regulating social media companies, think about this. This is not just about antitrust. It's not just about breaking up Facebook and Instagram. It's thinking about ways in which the public debate, public policy can be informed by the data that's being collected by these companies, so that this sort of greatest data sets for advancing social science that have ever been created are not just used to maximize the profits of a few small companies, but they're actually used to help us answer these kind of crucial public policy questions. And so that's my spiel. I try to insert that in whenever I get a chance. So that's.
I'm sure Oscar, yeah, I'm sure that Oscar and Michael would like to jump in here. So please, Oscar and then Michael.
No, I think this is it's a little bit of Russia, but it still has everything to do with the media climate we are today. And I think that, I mean, this is something that we've been writing and thinking quite a lot about at the center, what we need to do, and should we at this point starting to consider these platforms and regulate them as public utilities, which we're doing with telcos, for instance, that needs to carry everyone's traffic, or banks, which needs to do certain thing as a public utility, whereas this is the foundation of our democratic debate, and it's not only as Yosha said, that they're there to maximize profit, which is, no, it's true, they're there to maximize profit, but they maximize profit by inducing behavioral change. And this is the fascinating part. And this means collecting all the data that's possible, but also effectively applying it to make you behave differently, to consume this, to vote this, to go to this thing. And why they have become, within a decade, the biggest company of the world has ever seen. I mean, 2008, ExxonMobil was the biggest company of the world. Apple is 7 times the size of that now, is because they're super effective at inducing behavioral change. We're going off of Russia, but I want to underline what I said before, that Russian strategists figured this out, that this is a formidable machinery for inducing behavioral change in people, both in Russia and globally. And that, therefore, a lot of our contemporary conflict is being played out there. Michael, please.
Yes, and I would just echo, what you mentioned earlier about your advertisement feeds. I have the same issues go on. So part of the issue is we don't even know what data necessarily that these companies are gathering because they have so many ways to do it with the devices that we use just when we log on. And without a doubt, as Joshua mentioned, you can purchase some of this information. Anyone can, any group can, but we really are at the mercy of those individual platforms as to what data they will give us for whatever type of purchase agreement that we might make. And then when we start thinking about places like Russia, where in VK and those type of platforms, that might be more interesting for us to understand how the Russians are thinking and acting toward us in this information environment. Those laws are completely different and can guard that data even more so than we might be unaware here in the West.
Thank you. I have a question specifically for Oscar by a student who read your book. I was struck by the extent to which Russian officials believe that color revolutions are a real and established way of war in the West. How do Russian analysts reconcile the lack of an obvious colored revolution technique in U.S. doctrine or training, and what do they consider relevant disciplines or techniques? Who do the Russians consider color revolution experts in the West? And if you could please define the terms for our audience that hasn't heard the term color revolution.
Sure, absolutely. There's a very direct answer to the question first. This is Gene Sharp, and I mean, in the 90s and early 2000s, he was one of the most feared men in Russia. So color revolution comes originally from a set of not really revolutions even, but that's another story. But they call revolutions: the Rose Revolution in Georgia 2003 and the Orange Revolution in Ukraine 2004. Then also the Tulip Revolution in Kyrgyzstan 2005, but it shouldn't be included because it wasn't really a color revolution, but that's another story. What happened was basically pro-democracy protesters protested against a rigged election using non-violent methods, getting a corrupt kleptocrat toppled, and installing a new leader that was decidedly more pro-Western. The perception, how this grew to be perceived as a part of warfare, really comes down to the fact that this has been struck against. It's been Russia's biggest geopolitical setbacks has been largely through color revolutions. So its most close countries and neighbors, Ukraine 2 times, also of course Euromaidan uprising that led to the Austria of Yanukovych. What was been going in Belarus the last 6 months fits this bill perfectly. And of course, what Navalny seems to trying to do in Russia is there as well. And essentially it's perceived that the West is so effective at brainwashing the people of saying, hey, you can be in democracy, hey, you can be in market economy. You just need to go and protest. And it's perceived as a notion that we, through our information influence, through our special operation branches, through our political support to dissidents and our human rights work, are that effective in making citizens topple their own leaders. This is not completely far-fetched, though. I mean, there are, as always, there's some grains of truth, and then they're always blown up by paranoia. Just take, for example, 2003, Mikhail Saakashvili in Georgia went in the spring to a workshop in Serbia where he was trained in non-violent protest methods, drawing upon the ideology of Gene Sharp, who's been pioneering those. And, you know, he and his closest associates did it, and they were financed by the National Endowment for Democracy, the National Democratic Institute, International Republican Institute. Then they go back to Georgia, and they lead the REUSS revolution largely through non-violent protest methods. And then they say they want to join NATO, and then they want to, you know, get so much closer to the West. So from the Russian perspective, this is not just chance and coincidence that they receive pro-Western funding and then they go and do it. And this, as I show in the book, you know, same in Ukraine. They went to the same trainings. Russian oppositions were in Maidan in 2004, then went in 2005 and trying to do the same thing there. And to be completely frank, it's actually not fully surprised that Russian leaders see this as a part of Western strategy when the White House lists the color revolutions as its achievements. The George W. Bush White House listed it as achievements in their first term. The color revolutions, the rose and the orange revolution. So if we are publicly taking credit for revolutions which we, and I'm talking not me personally, we have nothing to do with, then of course maybe it's not too far-fetched that Russian leadership will believe it, even though there are, you know, completely spontaneous revolutions that happen in election feuds. So long story short, Gene Sharp has to largely be seen as the ideologue, and it has to do, I mean, it only takes a mediocre Russian intelligence analyst to see that NATO is not about to launch a military invasion to Russia. You know, don't have the posture, don't have the interest, barely don't have the capabilities. But today there are, you know, people on the streets of Moscow, people in the streets of Minsk, and there were people in the streets of Kyiv really challenging the legitimacy of the model that we're seeing, and that I would say ties into why this has become seen as a key part of modern war.
Thank you, Oscar. I would like to give Michael and Joshua 2 minutes each to just wrap up before we close our discussion. First, Michael.
Well, thank you very much for having me, and thank you to all the panelists for sharing this time. I would just say that as we face the sort of challenge of misinformation, in this case, particularly from Russia, we really are faced with a challenge of obtaining the data so that we can understand how they are influencing various target audiences and the narratives that they're using to do that. I think machine learning and our algorithms are great for collecting that information, but in the end, we definitely need dedicated analysts who can understand this problem set and go deeper into a breakdown of various accounts, various narratives, and to find those various influencers. So I am very privileged to be part of that, and I'm very privileged to be able to talk to you all about that as well today. Thank you.
Thank you, Joshua.
Yeah, so thanks so much for having me here today. I share Michael's, feel very privileged to be here and to have the chance to talk to you. If I was to close with a closing thought, it would be, don't believe what you hear about social media and what you hear about social media's impact. Go deeper than that. Seek out the rigorous research on this, do the deep dives. We didn't even get a chance to talk about this today, but we have a new paper at the Center for Social Media and Politics here at NYU, where we've been investigating the impact of exposure to tweets by Russian trolls on Twitter during the 2016 election using a kind of innovative panel design where we link social media data to the panel. And the net result of this is there is no impact. And indeed, we can tease out why that's the case in the sense that we are able to show that so many of those tweets were shown to just a small number of people. And those small number of people were exactly the type of people you would already have been expected to be supporting the Republican candidate for president, and dwarfed by the number number of tweets people saw from traditional media sources, dwarfed by the number of tweets they saw from U.S. politicians and candidates. So go for those deeper dives. Go in deeper. When you hear someone telling you this is the way it is on social media, ask yourself, how do we know that's the way it is? And how can we be more sure that's the way it is? And what kind of evidence might make us question whether or not that's the way it is? Because things are not always as they first seem. And there's a lot of data out there and it's hard to sort of analyze it, but keep pushing ourselves to try to do this because, as both speakers said, this is crucial. This is where people are getting their information about society, about life, about politics. This is how foreign adversaries like Russia and the United States are contesting with one another right now, and we can't settle for the quick and easy answers. And one thing we've learned as scholars is that in this field, if scholars don't do the hard work to try to get answers to these questions, there are tons of pundits who are willing to sort of fill the airways with easy answers to these questions. And we've got to, as scholars, strive to make sure that the rigorous scientific research surfaces. So thank you so much for having me here today. It's been a real pleasure.
Thank you so much to Joshua Tucker, Oscar Johnson, and Michael Bracey. As we conclude our discussion, I want to thank you for being such a terrific panel and for taking the time to share your expertise with us. As was evident from our discussion, the unique value of the Forum on Russian, European, and U.S. Security is that we bring together European and American perspectives, military professionals, and academics for a comprehensive discussion on these security issues, and we will continue to do that with our next 3 sessions. The recording of this session will be available shortly. Please join us next week for our 3rd session in this 4-part series, Strategies for Combating Disinformation. I think we offered a nice segue into that 3rd discussion. Thank you to everyone from SOCOM, from USF, who made this wonderful forum possible. Goodbye, everyone. Please stay safe, and we'll see you soon.